for those who aren't here. Um, then let me reshare the screen with audio. Okay, so, oops. So YouTube's not working in PowerPoint anymore. I have to actually go over to the YouTube link. Keep in mind with Zoom, sometimes these videos can come out quite loud on your side. So just be prepared to lower your volume. But we're going to look at why Russia became so big, why it's such a large country.
Russian Federation is a huge country stretching from the Baltic and the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It is the largest country on Earth. Its total area is more than 17 million square kilometers. It was bigger than that in the Soviet period and even larger in the Tsaristic period. So why is Russia so big? Well, for this gigantic land is a big reason. Siberia. Under Ivan the Terrible, Russian Cossacks moved to conquer lands on the east of the Ural Mountains, into Siberia and the Far East. These regions account for more than 75% of the Russian total area. In other words, it was the conquest of Siberia that turned Russia into the largest country geographically. Moscow did not encounter any problems in the conquest and incorporation of the eastern territories, Siberia being a cold land with just one guy per square kilometer in that time. Even with this low density of people, Russians begin to trade, especially fur. The local tribes had no problems with Russians, so they had no objections to joining Russia, seeing Western people as a new way of trading their goods. Year by year expanding into the east, in the 1645 Russians reached the Pacific Ocean. This massive land was pretty hard to control, so Russians developed more trade routes and they built settlements for the new migrants which are coming from the west. As a pretty large country, they need some exits to the sea. Even if they got that in the north, it wasn't a good deal for them, because in the cold season this side was frozen. So in the 18th century they got access to the Baltic Sea, defeating Sweden, and access to the Black Sea by defeating the Ottoman Empire. Because of the powerful trade nodes between the Far East and Europe, and with these two new exits to the seas, the Russian Empire became a superpower. In the following years, Russians would get more territories in Europe from Poland and Ottoman Empire, conquering in time the Kazakh and Turkic tribes from the Central Asia. While many empires fell in time due to invasions and bad administrations, Russia was and is a massive land with pretty cold winters. Without any very powerful potential enemy to the east and to the south to conquer them, Russians managed to resist even against the large invasions. Russia in the present is not as large as it was, but it's still the largest country on earth, being a superpower. Thank you for watching this short video.
Okay. So we had our amazing presenter there talking about the Russian Federation. Okay. All right. Let me make sure. Okay, so we're going to get into in a little bit. We're going to talk specifically about why. Part of the reason why Russia became such a large country, and you saw how, a big part of it was being able to expand trading with those in Siberia. But we'll also look at some other reasons of why Russia was able to expand its territory so much. But let's go ahead and look at the opposite of the largest country, and we talk about the smallest countries. And we have two different ways to define small countries or small states. And the first one, which is one of your vocabulary words, is a city-state. So city-states are sovereign states comprised entirely of a city and its countryside. So a couple examples, we have Singapore, Monaco, and San Marino. But can anybody think of any other examples of city-states?
There's the Vatican City.
Okay, Vatican City. Great example there in the middle of Rome. It's its own sovereign state. It's one of the smallest in the world, but for all intents and purposes, it's its own state, housed within the country of Italy. city of Rome. Can anybody think of another one? Okay. How about Hong Kong? Hong Kong, technically today, it's still considered its own sovereign state, even though it's kind of under the influence and sphere of China, and China is very much trying to um, increase its control over Hong Kong. But right now, it's still a city state. Hong Kong is pretty much a really large city. There's very little actual countryside or green space in Hong Kong, but it fits that definition of what a city state is. Then we get to what are known as microstates, and they're just very small land areas, and they don't necessarily always have um, a city component to it. Um, and so microstates would include, say, Monaco. Monaco is about 1.5 square kilometers, which is, I don't know, that's about three square miles. So think about the city of Magna being a country. Um, so usually there is a city associated with a microstate, but not always. Um, some other examples of microstates we have Singapore, Andorra, and Bahrain. Um, but for all intents, all you really need to know between the two is that a city-state is going to be um, a country that its primary territory is a city, like Singapore, like Hong Kong, like the Vatican City, while microstates are going to be those that may have cities within them, but the city is not the defining area. So, like Monaco, um, and in certain parts of Singapore as well. Okay, so let me move this guy up here. Okay, so another way to understanding how states interact with each other and how borders are formed is understanding the shape of states. So we have a couple of different categories in how we define the shape, size, or the size of states. And the first one we're going to look at is what are known as compact states. So compact states are states where they pretty much look like an imperfect circle, where you have sometimes a jagged outline, but it's generally a circular shape, and it looks very compact and usually has the capital in the center of the country. So some great examples are like country of Uruguay, Zimbabwe, and Poland. Now, why do you think it'd be a good advantage or good idea to have your capital in the middle of your country? What's an advantage to having um, your capital in the center of the country? Okay, yeah. So, I think you're right, Pedro, in the sense that, uh, being able to be centrally located in that, it doesn't really take you a long time to get from one, you know, to get from the center to one of the outlying parts of your territory. Um, okay, yeah. And Tegan, you're right in that another big advantage, aside from being able to access your land, your territory, is also protecting it. So that's how Poland, well, it wasn't Poland prior to World War One, but um, empires and countries like Poland have their capital in the middle, so that way, uh, during a typical attack, they're not, they have a lot more territory that they can defend before the capital is taken over. Because typically, when the capital is taken over of a country, that's when it's considered the country has fallen to the invader. But obviously, with like World War II, and we looked at World War II last week on Thursday. Um, with Poland, we had both the Soviets and the Germans invading from either side, and it was just inevitable. But the Poles were able to hold out a little bit longer because their capital was dead set in the middle of Poland. Okay. Yeah. And that's not necessarily says that the when a country is occupied or taken over their capital doesn't necessarily mean uh, complete countries is given up. If you think about what happened with France during World War II, we had a government in exile under Charles de Gaulle. He took his government and tried to maintain the country of France from England, from London. Um, and we just know that territorially speaking, a country has succumbed if the capital is taken over, not necessarily that the people have submitted or given up. Because that obviously wasn't the case in France or Poland, because we had a lot of uh, resistance movements in those countries. So this is what a compact state is going to look like. So if you look at Poland or Zimbabwe, circular looks pretty good. Very compact, a nice, decent, average size country. Nothing too much to complain about. The only problem is that usually compact states are landlocked, so they don't necessarily have good access to trading. Then we have what are known as corrupt states. These are pretty much identical to compact states, but they have some type of unique feature that makes them not compact. They usually have some type of extension of land that goes to, say, a sea or a port that makes them have access to more trade opportunities. And these could be naturally occurring just because of the physical geography, or they were made for a purpose. So a natural example of a corruption, think about the Strait of Gibraltar and Spain, how that kind of juts out away from Spain's kind of compact shape or decent shape, but Gibraltar kind of juts out. That's a natural phenomenon. There's nothing that they can really do about that. But we're going to look at a country like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it was actually intentionally corrupted. Maybe. Okay, it just stopped sharing. Okay. So this is what it looks like. So if we kind of zoom in and look at country, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you see how you have compact state right here. Got the capital kind of close to the center of the country, right? No. Where's the capital of Congo? Actually, the Congo's capital is not in the center. But anyways, in a typical compact state, you would have the capital towards the center. But you notice here how the country actually goes all the way out here to the Atlantic Ocean. Um, let's see here. And let me go back to, you need to look at the microstates just real quick. So under microstates, it's just smallest is Monaco, and then some examples include Singapore, Andorra, and Bahrain. Okay. All right. So yeah, so we're um, looking at countries like the Congo, and how it corrupts itself by jutting into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what's the big reason why they want to have access to the sea, to the ocean? Well, why would a state want access to the ocean? Boom, ports, shipping. Yeah, that's a big reason. Because if you're a landlocked country, there's going to be only a few ways that you're going to be able to export products, either over land through other countries. And usually you'll have to pay those other countries big export taxes, tariffs, or you'll have to go by river to get to hold on. Here, I got your message, Cooper. I'll respond to it at the end of class. But yeah, so corrupted states. This is how they. This is how they look. It's just going to be a typical state design, compact state, but there's going to be some type of land that just looks out of place. That just looks odd. Another example is with Namibia in Western Africa. We have a country. This is part of the country of Namibia, but it's actually a portion of the country that is access to the ocean versus. Wait, this isn't the right. This isn't the right example. I got to change the image. I got to change the imagery on this one. I'll come back to it though. Okay. Then we have what are known as elongated shapes. These are countries where you're going to just see a very large north and south border. So some countries like Norway, Vietnam, Chile, Italy, and Malawi. You're thinking about countries where their length may be thousands and thousands of miles, but the width could be some points only 60 miles wide. Now, the problem is that you could have a capital in the center of that country, but you could be thousands of miles from either end of the country. So what happens is you have a diversity when it comes to climate, resources, and people. But the problem is that you can't. It's very difficult to have national cohesion because you have people who are so diverse and so different at different ends of the continent potentially. Yeah, so Chile is the greatest example how you can be in the southern tip of Chile and it could be snowing and kind of tundra Arctic-like climate, and then you get to the northern part of Chile where it's tropical Amazon, well, a little bit of Chile, but most of it's desert actually when you get up to the north part. But it's a hot, dry climate. It's a lot different than what you experience in the southern part. With Vietnam, though, it's pretty much the same climate from north and south, but we have different political ideologies that come as a result of the great distance between north and south. So let's go ahead and look at what these look like. So obviously, as pointed out, Chile being a really prime example of an elongated state. Vietnam, though, we think back to Vietnamese history and how Vietnam was divided at one point. It still kind of is divided, even though it's all one country. But we had what was North and South Vietnam. North Vietnam being very close to China and Russia, to the Soviet Union, and had a lot more ties and closeness to communism, while in the South, in Ho Chi Minh City, which is known as Saigon, there's more liberated democratic beliefs, and it was difficult for Hanoi, for the North, to put a clamp down on what's going on in the South because of the physical geography and the way that the structure of the state is set up. Yeah. But you can see even a country like Norway during World War II, we notice how the Nazis were easily able to occupy and take over land in the South. And the North was still kind of liberated. There wasn't a lot of Nazi occupation in the northern part because of the elongated way the state was set up. And actually, the Soviets ended up occupying and preserving parts of this part of Norway during World War II. as the Nazis weren't able to extend their reach all the way up here. Okay, so let's go ahead look at some really weird borders out there. Yeah, I wish I could have voted out some students last hour. They're acting
Yeah, if
mighty
you enjoyed
sus.
it, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some of the strangest borders in the world. And here we go.
Our world is defined by borders between continents, countries, provinces, states, cities, towns, and villages. And when you really think about it, borders are a strange concept. At some point in time, people from one community decided that an imaginary line should separate their culture, their identity, and their traditions against outsiders. Having borders is how we can collectively make sense of the world, and it's also how we can govern our societies. Most borders make a lot of sense if the languages are different, such as France and Germany, or if they're divided by natural landscapes, like how the Himalayan mountains separate India from Nepal. But there are many bizarre borders that I've discovered during my travels, which I'm going to share with you in today's video. The first strange border that we're going to talk about today is the one between North Korea and South Korea, two countries that are technically still at war because a peace treaty has never been signed. This border, known as a DMZ or demilitarized zone, is 160 miles long and was established after the Korean War ended in 1953. It's also the thickest border in the world at 2.5 miles wide. There is one place called the Joint Security Area, or JSA, on the west side of the DMZ where the two countries hold meetings and negotiations. It's also open to tourism, where I've been many times in the past, and every visitor is required to sign a waiver that notes the possibility of injury or death. The second bizarre border I'm going to tell you about today is called Kaliningrad, which is a Russian territory right in the middle of the European Union. It's situated between Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic Sea, some 1,088 kilometers west of Moscow, but it's still extremely Russian. The entire state of Kaliningrad, which has a population just shy of 1 million people, was formerly called Königsberg, capital of East Prussia, but it was captured by the Red Army in 1945 and ceded to the Soviet Union at the Potsdam Conference. Even though I haven't been to Kaliningrad yet, it's high on my list because I know it's one of the stranger places to go in Europe, and it just boggles my mind that you're like in Russia, but you're not in Russia, but you're in Russia. I don't know, guys. If you like weird places like I do, then you should definitely add it to your list. That leads me to the third strangest border that I want to tell you about today, and that is around the country of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan proper borders Georgia, Armenia, Russia, and Iran, four countries that have all been at war with each other in one way or another over the last century. When I went to Azerbaijan, I really loved it, especially the city of Baku. I loved how it was super modern and super old school at the same time, but I kept scratching my head about the places around it. Tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan have caused that 1,000-kilometer border to be closed, but that's not even the most interesting part. The most bizarre thing here is a de facto state, or unrecognized territory, called Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but most of the region is governed by the Republic of Artsakh, who are made up of Christian Armenians. You cannot enter Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan, only from Armenia, so if you try to visit the former with a Nagorno-Karabakh stamp in your passport, then you'll probably be denied. All of my travel buddies who have been to Nagorno-Karabakh told me really wild stories, and I really hope to get there someday soon. Alright guys, the fourth strangest border that I want to tell you about today is the Diomede Islands, which separate Russia and the United States. Yes, they are neighboring countries. There are two islands which consist of rocky plateaus in the middle of the Bering Strait between mainland Alaska and Russian Siberia. Both islands are separated by the international date line, something like Samoa and American Samoa, which means they are 24 hours apart. Traveling to the Diomede Islands is nearly impossible. You must charter a flight or helicopter and it will land on ice. The only town of Diomede has 135 people, and their ethnic group is called the Inuit, similar to the ones I saw in eastern Greenland when I was in the town of Itotokormit.
Itokotomin.
Itokortomin.
It's just like you could also pronounce English words quickly, like eat, cut, duck, door, Meat.
Eat kataktormit.
Yeah.
That leads me into my fifth and final strange border that I would like to tell you guys about today, and that is the beautiful continent of Antarctica. We tend to think of Antarctica as a place that is essentially uninhabited and unclaimed, but it actually has some of the most interesting territorial disputes in the world. Below is a map of the land currently claimed on the continent. If you look closely, you'll see some of the land being unclaimed and some having double or triple ownership, but technically none of it matters because every single one of these countries has signed the Antarctic Treaty, which basically states that none of these claims imply any sovereignty to the claiming nations. To make things even stranger, somehow the United States and Russia have reserved the rights to own parts of Antarctica in the future, but I guess we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. On a personal note, I just want to say that I love Antarctica. I took an 18-day cruise down there a few years ago, and it is absolutely one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful place we have on our planet.
Okay. All right. So let me see what's going on. Okay. Let's see. We have some imposters among us. It seems. Hopefully, we vote out the imposters correctly. Though I don't know. There's a couple of you acting sus. All right. Let us continue on. So hopefully, with that video, looking at some of these weird borders, we're not necessarily looking at the actual layout of the border, but rather we are looking at, what defines it as a border. If we look at between North and South Korea and how, North and South Korea are technically still part of the same country, if you really think about it, because they went to war with each other and they never finalized that war. They never made peace with each other or signed a peace treaty. And so the international community still recognizes North and South Korea as separate countries when it comes to sovereignty, even though they're technically still recognized or even though they're technically still one country, just Korea. So, oops. Okay. So let us move on. We're talking about fragmented states now. So we're talking about countries that are composed entirely of islands, or we're talking about countries that are fragmented and broken up, like in Russia. So we have two different types. So we have ones that are separated by water. We're talking about island nations. Primarily, we see those in the Pacific Ocean and Polynesia. Indonesia is an example of a fragmented state. Then we have what are more continental countries like Russia, where you have most of the territory in one area, but then you have a little bit of the territory that borders with Poland. That's up in north of Poland, Kaliningrad. And with the island nations, that's just naturally occurring. You can't bring islands together physically, at least not with human power. But if we're talking from a perspective of Russia, the reason that Russia maintained Kaliningrad is so that they could have access to a warmer water port that's warmer than, say, the Gulf of Finland, St. Petersburg, and also just strategically being able to have territory that is kind of closer to the European Union and to the West, being able to maintain a little bit more of a sphere of influence, which we talk about spheres of influence coming up in the latter part of this unit. But the problem with sometimes having a fragmented government, not necessarily with Russia and Kaliningrad, but if we're talking about a country like Indonesia, if you have hundreds, even thousands of islands, it's very difficult to have a very strong centralized government, in the sense that that government can maintain control over all the islands. So we have some islands in Indonesia that are kind of rogue islands that don't necessarily follow what the government of Indonesia wants from those islands. But it's difficult for the country of Indonesia to enforce those laws if there's literally water obstacles between mainland Indonesia and some of the smaller outlying islands. Okay. So here we are with fragmented states. So Philippines and Indonesia, great examples of traditional fragmented states. Okay. So yeah, so these are fragmented states. Then we have what are known as perforated states. So these are states that are completely landlocked within a country. So some examples include San Marino in Italy, and thinking about the Vatican City as being a perforated state, where they're completely dependent on the state that they're within. So San Marino is a landlocked microstate that's within Italy, but they have to go through Italy to get anywhere else. To trade with anybody, they have to go through Italy. And so this can create a lot of obstacles for that country to grow or to have a strong economy because they're always dependent on that country that they're housed within. So another example is Lesotho in South Africa, which they depend heavily on South Africa to import items to sustain themselves and export those items. Okay, hopefully we are taking notes on the material as much as trying to vote class members out of the shape. Okay, so here are those examples of perforated states. So we have South Africa and Lesotho. We have San Marino, which is in Italy, and you can think of the Vatican City as being a perforated state. So when you ever hear that term perforated state, think of a country within a country inception, essentially. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start moving away from shapes of states and really talking about why it matters having, I'm sorry, what was that?
Can you go back real quick?
Yeah. Yeah, so what we're going to be now moving on to is looking more so at why countries want to have certain borders, why they want to have certain territory. Is it because that territory has resources, has access to trading opportunities, or is it just simply to have larger territory, like in the case of parts of Russia? Let's see. All right, are we good to move on? Okay. All right. So yeah, so we talked about absolute and relative locations in Unit 1, where we talked about like an absolute location is when you're giving specific coordinates and it's, the actual physical place. And then, relative location is when we're talking about and how it relates to nearby land. When you talk about Canada and Russia, its absolute location is in the northern latitudes. There's no denying that's where the territorial claims are, but relatively speaking, the land in northern Russia and Canada is actually very resource rich, and uh, it really depends on where that state is located. So Canada and Russia being in northern latitudes, the land in northern latitudes typically isn't wanted by other countries or states unless there is resources in that land, which we ultimately found out. But say back in the 1800s when Russia sold off Alaska to the United States, didn't realize that there's all this oil in Alaska. Had Russia, today, if the United States wanted to buy Alaska from Russia, they would say no, because there's so much, so many resources in Alaska. But nowadays, but that was back then. They felt that there isn't really any value to that land. It's Siberia. It's Arctic tundra, barren land. Um, but with their location in northern latitudes, they have so much less agricultural opportunities, and that makes that land kind of not as valuable unless it's resource rich. Okay, so when we talk about landlocked countries, so if we're talking about those perforated states, or we're talking about countries like Poland, well, not Poland, trying to think, like Kazakhstan, for example. These countries are at a major disadvantage when it comes to development because these countries don't really have the ability to really trade with countries beyond their borders. Obviously, they can trade pretty easily with their bordering countries, but they don't have the opportunity to go and put items on a ship and ship them over to the United States or China or whatever it may be, because they're landlocked, and so their development is quite limited when it comes to that.
Excuse me, can you go back?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Are we good to move on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah. So landlocked countries have such more disadvantage because you can have a big territorial claim like Kazakhstan, which is a massive country by land size, but its economic opportunities are so much more limited. While Singapore, being such a smaller city state or microstate, has such a massive economy due to its location, its relative location, that it is right dab in the middle of major trade routes between South and East Asia, parts of Australia, Polynesia, and then being able to access markets in the Americas. So really understanding that, well, I'm not going to phrase it like that. Basically, that your territorial claims, your size doesn't really, it doesn't really matter at the end. It really depends on your relative location. Where are you located? So, yeah, it's great that Russia has this massive land size, all of this Siberian land, but is it really, aside from resources, is it really any economic gain? No. But when you talk about Singapore, it's a very small country, but its economic output and development is so much greater because of its relative location. Okay, so these are the landlocked countries we have in the world. Now, if you look at these countries, we notice a pattern primarily. A lot of these countries have poor economic opportunities, that there's more poverty in these countries than countries that have access to coastlines. So if we look at Uruguay in South America, or we look at Saharan countries in Africa and Central Asia, if we looked at the economic data for those countries, we'd see a lot more poverty and we see a lot less economic opportunities, higher unemployment because of their lack of economic development opportunities. Okay, so let's kind of dive in now and talk specifically about boundaries. So really talking about how we draw lines and what it means to have territorial claim. So the way that we determine boundaries typically is just lines on a map. You have a map of the land area and you draw a line and that determines the border. But we like to think of it just in that perspective that it's just a two-dimensional realm. But in reality, borders are three-dimensional. Talking about airspace, what about satellites? If a satellite goes over a continent, a country, does that country have a right to charge that satellite's producer a tax for coming over to their country, just like they do for airlines that fly over their country? It's a very gray area nowadays when it comes to the territory and boundaries of airspace. Now, typically, some ways that these larger countries make money or government tax revenue is by charging airlines a certain amount of money to fly when they fly over their country. So if you're on a flight from, say, London to Sydney, Australia, you're going to pass over a lot of countries. And even though you're not technically landing in those countries, they have the right to charge the airline a tax for using their airspace. Generally speaking, countries have a right to about 60,000 feet above their country to claim access to right now. That's why a country can't charge a satellite producer for orbiting a satellite around above their country. But we think about the land above us, but we also have territorial claims below the surface. Anyways, this is just a visual representation of boundaries and territorial claims in a three-dimensional sense. That, yeah, we have our typical line boundary that we see on a map and can be sometimes marked by, like, say, a fence or a sign indicating this is the entry of the territory. But we have the airspace that is divided by this line. So as soon as you cross from country A's airspace to country B's airspace, you have to get permission from country B's airspace to enter into it. Then you have below the surface where you have minerals, resources that are down below, and you have to ensure that whatever you're mining remains in your territorial jurisdiction. Okay, so what we have here, we're looking at 2D map of Kuwait, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and looking at different resources. Now, Kuwait has obviously the authority to drill from these oil fields here because they're completely 100% in the territory of Kuwait. Now, do you guys think that Kuwait has the authority to drill from this oil field? That most of it is in Iraq. What do you guys think? You guys are right in the sense that oil fields that are within the confines of Iraq, usually the way that it works, the United Nations would look at that and say, okay, well, the majority of it is in Iraq, and so Iraq lays claim to that resource. Or if Kuwait and Iraq come up with a treaty, an agreement that says, okay, it looks like there's like maybe a fifth of this oil field that's in Kuwait, and the rest is in Iraq. We'll just divide it like that. You get a fifth of these oil resources, and and Iraq gets the other part of that, and that's ultimately what would come about if it's between Kuwait and Iraq. But generally speaking, it's the country that has the majority of the resources, and that's what matters. Okay. So boundaries are not always set in stone. Yeah. Thanks. Boundaries aren't always set in stone. They're always changing, modifying. When we're talking about how border disputes come about, we look at how, say, Kuwait and Iraq, if we're looking back at this example, if they had a dispute about their boundary, about their border, the first action that they need to do is talk with each other one-on-one. If both parties agree, if both countries agree that we're going to modify our boundary, then they establish a treaty. That's a legally binding document recognized by international community, and that is now the new boundary, if both countries agree to it. But more often than not, countries don't agree on their borders, and that then has to come down to being resolved, hopefully through the United Nations, or sometimes through conflict, through war. If we talk about, for example, we looked at World War II oversimplified last week, and we talked about how Hitler tried to expand Germany to get larger territorial claims. And with a country like Austria, they invaded, but Austria didn't really contest that. Not saying there wasn't any resistance, but the government of Austria didn't contest that annexation of the land. Then you get to Czechoslovakia, and you talked about how Czechoslovakia wasn't even included in the meeting between Germany, France, and England, when they're like, oh yeah, you can have this part of Czechoslovakia. Does that mean that Czechoslovakia agreed to that border change? No, they didn't at all. And so from Czechoslovakia's point of view, that boundary is not valid. But the rest of the world community in Europe recognized it as being true. And then eventually, Hitler takes over, expands into Poland and France, and that becomes conflict and an abuse of territorial expansion. So another great example of emerging, changing boundaries, because they're always changing even today. What's going on with Crimea, and how, depending on what side of the political spectrum you are in global politics, those who are aligned or allied with China and Russia will say that Crimea is a part of the Russian Federation now, that they formally succeeded from the Ukraine. They have a sovereign right to then annex and join the Russian Federation, while those on the more United States, Western Europe spectrum will say, no, that was complete violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, and Crimea has no authority to change the border and join the Russian Federation. Okay. So just got a couple terms here before we end class. So one of those important terms you want to make sure you have notes on writing down is the delimitation of boundaries. So this is how we formally write borders on a map. Delimitation is that process by which you're actually drawing the lines and saying, okay, if you're within the confines of these lines, that is your jurisdiction. That is where the government, the state, has authority and power. Once you cross that line, you are no longer in the confines of that state. And that's known as delimitation. So obviously, having a set in stone border and boundary, once you cross that line, the country that you're leaving has no judicial or jurisdictional claim over you. Okay, then we have demarcation, which is instead of just drawing the line on the map, we actually have the marking of that boundary. So actually, in the country, on the border, you have either a sign it can be as simple as a sign, or all the way up to a border wall, actually making a fence and a border around the country. So the demilitarized zone is a great example of that. How we've built fences both in parts of the U.S.-Mexican border and parts of the U.S.-Canadian border have fences to mark that official border and boundary. Then we have, let's see. Okay. Yeah, delimitation is actually writing the border, and then demarcation is actually marking that ground now. If you've tried to attempt to write this border, but the world community is not recognizing it, not recognizing the delimitation, through demarcation, you can actually try to establish that border by potentially sending troops into an area and marking the border through military strength, military might. That's one way of expanding territorial claims. Obviously, that could potentially cause conflict, especially the country that you're trying to, expand territory into. Okay, so 2 more slides left. So we have a couple different types of boundaries. We have what are known as
Can
somebody-
you go back a slide?
to the demarcation.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, so while you're finishing up with this, we have different types of actual boundaries. We have what are known as physical boundaries, which we'll cover in the next slide. Basically, anything from rivers, lakes, mountains that actually physically divide area. And so usually there's a lot of country borders that are defined by physical traits. Think of the US-Mexican border along Texas, which is divided by the Rio Grande River. That's an example of how physical boundary, physical border comes into play. That you can't really, it's easy, and especially back the days before GPS, it was easy to say, okay, this side of the river's mine, the other side of the river is yours. Same goes for like big mountain ranges. It's easy to say, well, this side of the mountain's ours, that side of the mountain's yours. Okay. Now that can cause some disputes because, it can be a matter of perspective on how we view what's considered this side of the mountain and that side of the mountain. Say with the river changes course. Does that mean that that part of the river that no longer exists, is it now part of this side or that side? And so that can cause disputes, even if it's just a small land change. Okay.
Didn't that happen in some states?
Yeah. Talking about between Iowa and Nebraska. I think we looked at that last week where Nebraska and Iowa were divided by the Missouri River, and there was a point where in the 1800s there was a massive flood, and what used to be part of Iowa was now on the Nebraska side, west part of the river, and Nebraska said, "Oh, it's ours now," and Iowa said, "No, it's still part of Iowa. We have a city there." And they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "No, it's a part of Iowa still. There's nothing that's changed except the flow of the river." But that doesn't necessarily come true when it says like the Rio Grande River. Fortunately, in the United States and Mexico have channels in place so that if there is a massive change with the Rio Grande River, that they can actually come to terms and figure out how they're going to change that territory if it needs to be changed. And there are parts of the United States on the west side of the Rio Grande River. But sometimes the United States will just cede that land to Mexico, and then Mexico will do the same to the United States. Okay, so this is the last slide. Just really wanted to start talking about when it comes to international waters and international or where your border goes beyond the sea. So basically, what we have is from your shoreline all the way out to 12 nautical miles, so about 14 land miles. That's your territory. That is your country. You have absolute sovereignty and right to that land, to that ocean. Then when you get past 12 miles, nautical miles, you get into what is known as the um, exclusive economic zone. So this is an area that you don't necessarily have the right to sovereignty over that land, but if you want to pass trade ships through, military vessels, cruise ships, whatever it may be, you have absolute right to do that. But you can't say build an island in that 200-mile zone and lay claim to new territory. So basically, first 12 miles, you're in that country. Past 12 miles, you're in the economic sphere of that country. But if you're in that economic zone, you you're, for like say criminal perspective, you are still in you're considered in international waters. So say you were fleeing prosecution from a country and you made it for 12 nautical miles outside of that shore, you are in international waters and they can't touch you. They don't have jurisdiction. But they are still allowed to run their ships, whatever it may be, through that zone. So that's why if you have taken a cruise from California to Hawaii, you're required to have a passport with you because you leave the United States and you enter international waters, even though you're going only from, one state to the other. All right. Do you guys have any questions on these territorial claims?
I don't really have a question, but didn't Iceland and the UK have a dispute, like multiple disputes, because Iceland wanted to increase its territorial waters because of fishing?
Yeah, I don't know I haven't heard that specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised because at least here in the United States, we don't necessarily have to worry about other countries like fighting over, um, maritime territory. But when you get into Europe, especially, between say Iceland and the UK, or if you get say between Japan and China, a lot more disputes in these international waters, and this is where these agreements come into play. So like right now, China is trying to claim land in the South China Sea. They're building islands in the middle of the South China Sea so that they can say that this is now part of China. We've artificially created land that is now part of China. And we'll talk about that on Wednesday when we talk about some border disputes. But yeah, no, that's a great example of how, it sounds great on paper on how, okay, yeah, we can agree 12 miles is fine and having some economic zone. But when it comes into play and when there's resources at play, sometimes countries abandon these principles and laws. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, oops. Okay, let's just see. Yeah, if there isn't anything else that needs to be addressed, okay. Yeah, I'll have to look at this video, Pedro, and look at what's going on between the UK and Iceland. Okay, so just keep in mind, I know some of you guys have been talking about, stuff that wasn't relevant to class in the chat. Just keep in mind that this recorded Zoom is only going to be given to those who weren't actually in the Zoom. But just try to make sure you're paying attention and make sure that we're paying attention to what's here in class, because if you are playing a game in class, I would not allow that. So just keep that in mind. If there's no other questions or concerns, you guys are free to go ahead and leave the Zoom. I will plan on seeing you at the same time on Wednesday.
Thank you.
And then if Brianna, if you could stick around just for a minute. All right, Brianna, can you hear me, or are you able to chat? Oh, hi. Is it Brianna or Brianna?
Brianna.
Brianna, okay. Well, welcome to class. Are you coming from Mr. Nowicki's class? Or did you have Mr. Nowicki? Okay. So basically, obviously you're coming right when we're going to virtual learning. But the course, I'm sure you've been able to look over the Canvas page. It's hopefully pretty well put together. So what I will end up doing, since you came in kind of right at the beginning of Unit 4, I'm still in the process of recording the first lecture for the distance learners. So once I get that posted, you'll just want to watch that. And then there on the Canvas, there are the videos from previous quarters. So like from Unit 1, Unit 2. You'll want to be able to watch those videos. It's not a requirement because there's no assignment attached to it for your course grade here, but for the AP exam, you want to make sure to just watch those videos so that you can understand Unit 1 and Unit 2. And we're now on Unit 4 because we're doing Unit 3. We reverse them. But basically how the course works, there's a field journal that's right there in the assignments tab. It's something that you'll have for each unit. In the field journal, we have starters at the beginning of class, so usually 2 to 3 questions you just respond to. And then there's a section where you post a picture of your notes that you've taken for class. So that's all that's in the field journal. Each unit, I take a look at it, and that counts towards your grade. And then the other part of the grades in this class is the weekly assignments. So those are going to be on Canvas. We had the first one, which was due yesterday, but obviously you get an extension for just joining the class. But usually it'll be, questions that look similar to questions you'll see on the AP exam, and you just work through them based on what we've done for the week. And then once in a while we might have a reading, but I let everybody know well ahead of time about the reading. Did you have any questions other than that? All right. I don't know if your video froze up for a little bit, but yeah, if you have any questions or concerns along the way, please just reach out to me, send me a message, an email. Canvas messages are probably the easiest for me to respond to, but whatever works. And then yeah, if you need anything, just let me know. But I'm excited to have you here in class. Okay. Tegan, are you still here?
Yes.
All right. What's up?
My question was, if like you mentioned like 2 people on a side of a river or something,
Mm-hmm.
and the border somethings, what if the river kind of loops and he only gets like a quarter of what like the other person got?
Like if the river changes.
Not if the river changes, it's just if he doesn't know the whole river layout, and so the other person gets like 1,000 miles and he gets like 200 miles.
Well, that has happened in the past. If you talk about state, state borders, even down to like county level borders, but don't necessarily see that on an international scale, because ultimately nowadays, we have GPS and we can obviously tell, what's on either side of the river. But back in the old days, especially in the Wild West, Western days. Say like 2 different property owners, if they divided it against the river, there's a good chance that sometimes they would get cheated out of the right, right size of property.
Neat.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Did you have anything else?
Not really.
All right. We'll see. Well, thanks for coming to Zoom. I'll see you. You're in Success tomorrow, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I'll see you tomorrow morning.
Neat. See you later. Have a good day.